This podcast is developed by BridgeBio to educate ourselves and the public about living with a rare disease. Since our guests aren't scripted and are free to speak their minds, their views and opinions don't necessarily reflect the views and policy of BridgeBio Pharma. Now, we hope you enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to On Rare, a rare disease podcast produced by BridgeBio, a biotech company that focuses on developing treatments for rare diseases. I'm your host, Mandy Rorick, a member of the Patient Advocacy team, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, David Rintell, head of Patient Advocacy. Hi, David.
Hi, Mandy. Thank you very much. Very excited about interviewing today's guest.
I am too. Today, we get to visit with Jay. Jay lives with a condition called erythropoietic protoporphyria, or EPP. It's a condition that's characterized by really intense and severe pain upon exposure to sunlight. Before we get to talk with Jay, let's talk to Dr. Bhavik Shah. He will help us understand a little bit more what EPP is.
Yeah. Mandy, EPP is a condition that is not very well known, not very well understood by most of us. I, for one, went out, took a walk in the sun this morning and really felt rejuvenated by it. But people with EPP, when the sun is shining, really need to be very cautious about exposure to the sun. So let's hear more about it. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bhavik Shah to On Rare. He's the Vice President of Research for Genetic Medicine at Portal Therapeutics, which is a BridgeBio affiliate working on erythropoietic porphyria. Hi, Bhavik. How are you doing today?
Hi, David. Great to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, thank you very much for helping us understand. I'm just going to say EPP because it's so hard to pronounce, erythropoietic porphyria, and much harder to live with it, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
So, Bhavik, if we start from the very beginning, most rare diseases are genetic disorders, and is that true for EPP?
Yes, EPP is a genetic indication caused by autosomal recessive mutations in a gene that codes for an enzyme. Now, enzyme is a protein that converts one chemical into another. This particular genetic condition results in an excessive buildup of an intermediate called PP9 in blood. So, as blood passes through blood vessels under the skin, PP9 absorbs lights. It sets off a chemical reaction, which results in excruciating pain and burning sensation. Now, it's important to understand that the type of light that PP9 absorbs is a bit different than the type of light that causes a sunburn.
So, Bhavik, an autosomal recessive genetic disorder means that both parents need to be carriers of a gene, but people can be carriers of a rare condition without anyone in the family ever developing this condition. So I'm guessing it comes as a surprise to families when a child develops EPP.
Yes, exactly right, David.
So, Bhavik, that was very clear, and I want to make sure I understand. There's a genetic mutation that causes a change in an enzyme, and that causes a person with EPP to have much more of this stuff called PP9. And PP9 circulates in the blood. It is highly sensitive to light. When PP9 is exposed to light, it sets off a reaction that causes pain in the area of the skin, excruciating pain. Do I have that right?
No, exactly right, David.
Is it just pain, or is there also a visible change on the skin, or can it be either?
So it's usually non-blistering pain, so you won't see blisters, but upon multiple sunlight exposure, which often patients refrain from because they are very sensitive once they go through that pain, they do have some marks on their skin.
So an exposure to strong sunlight, for example, causes not just pain, but it also could cause a change in the skin, a mark that could remain.
A repeated exposure, absolutely.
I see. I'm guessing this varies a bit from person to person, but how much sun can cause that? How much exposure to sun can cause it?
I think great question. Person to person, the sensitivity to sunlight is a bit different. Different people may have a different mutation that may cause a different level of defect in the enzyme. But typically, individuals with EPP can be under the sun only for a few minutes, handful of minutes.
Wow. Very difficult to live life without being able to be under the sun.
Absolutely.
And is there any other type of light that causes the PP9 to react in this way?
No, it's essentially the UVA or visible light.
And mostly does this start to occur in childhood?
So it is usually first noted in childhood, David, so roughly around age of 1 or 2.
We've heard so far in a previous podcast that it is pretty difficult to diagnose this condition.
Absolutely. Usually children with this sort of symptoms, they are often overlooked. And to be honest, a lot of doctors are not aware of these conditions either. A specialist dermatologist knows about it. And for diagnosis, there are essentially a few types of blood tests verified by eventually genetic tests.
EPP can be extremely limiting. Most of us don't think twice about going out in the sun, or if we think about it, we think, oh, how great, it's sunny out. I love going for a walk, before I start work, expose myself to the sun and feel better. And people with EPP just have the opposite. They have to really be very cautious.
Again, like you said, I do want to belabor a point that, there is a marked impairment in the quality of life.
And Bhavik, after exposure to the sun, a person experiences pain. How long does the pain last? Does it eventually subside?
This is actually a really interesting question, David. After a few minutes, they get specific symptoms: burning, itching, tingling, which serves essentially as a warning signal. If individuals choose to stay for longer under sunlight, that's when they have this phototoxic attacks in form of excruciating pain, which may last for days. It's important to note that pain medications is not going to work on this patient. So it is very debilitating. Many of these patients essentially develop this fear after this phototoxic attack and just avoid going into sunlight. And this is what essentially results in this marked reduction or impairment in quality of their life, where they can't do day-to-day functions.
Right. And by phototoxic, photo being light and toxic being kind of poisonous, right?
Yes.
So that's the being poisoned by the light.
Absolutely. I think it's a great way to say that.
Which is a very frightening thing to think about. So I understand that EPP can really reduce quality of life, and you have to be extremely cautious about exposure to the sun. How do people manage this condition?
As you can imagine, it's sensible to essentially avoid the unnecessary exposure to the light. And the most obvious first line of measures that patients take includes wearing a protective clothes. Now, I do want to point out that sunscreen is not effective because it is designed for sunburns, which is, like I said earlier, it's a different type of light that causes you sunburn.
And Bhavik, is there any currently available treatment for this condition, either preventive or to treat the damage done by sun exposure?
Yes, there is one approved treatment for EPP. It essentially works by increasing pigmentation in your skin. What that does is create a type of a barrier between blood that flows into your superficial skin, blood vessels, and the light. This treatment have shown improvement in sunlight sensitivity, but only it adds few additional minutes of pain-free exposure to sunlight. I think there is still huge amount of unmet need that needs to be resolved.
Yeah. So there's really a need for a better treatment that would enable people to regain quality of life by being able to be exposed longer to the sun like the rest of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really helpful, Bhavik. And as we listen to Jay, I think this introduction will be very, very useful.
Okay, I hope it listens well.
It's good.
Wonderful.
I'm really pleased to welcome Jay to our podcast. Jay is a person living with erythropoietic protoporphyria, or EPP. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you so much for having me, David. It's an honor to be here.
We are honored by your presence and very grateful you're joining us.
Thank you.
I like to start at the beginning. So what do you recall as the first moment that anything that you now connect to this condition entered your life?
Well, I was diagnosed at age 7 years old by a pediatric dermatologist in Connecticut, where I grew up. My memories of having porphyria before knowing, formally what it was, extend much earlier than that, and probably even pre-verbally. And some of the earlier memories, have been relayed by my parents, who, definitely saw that I was suffering from something. Some of my earliest memories, being a child in kindergarten or first grade and not being able to be outside in gym class or be outside for long periods of time during recess due to exposure to the sun.
Yeah. And what did you think was going on, and what did the adults tell you about being outside during that time, pre-diagnosis?
I just knew that being outside for too long resulted in a pretty severe pain and sort of a burning, stinging pain on my skin and most often on the kind of the backs of my hands, the tops of my hands, and on my face, where the most severe reactions would occur. I think part of the challenge was when I was growing up was that the symptoms are not always visible in EPP, and that made it difficult for me to convey the pain and the symptoms I was experiencing when I was younger to physicians that my parents would bring me to. And so, I knew something was going on just at the level of pain and experience. But because the symptoms are not always visible, I kind of went through a train of doctors before I finally came to this pediatric dermatologist that ultimately diagnosed me.
Yeah. Before you go on, I just want to make note of this. So you experienced pain in your skin after spending time outdoors, but your symptoms were not visible. So in other words, there was nothing showing on your skin, and you go and see a physician or someone and they don't see anything.
That's exactly right. In some cases, in a very severe, prolonged reaction, I would get some degree of swelling, some degree of redness, maybe some marks from scratching at my skin. So in some cases, it was evident. And my mom had captured, I think a number of photos from some of those more severe reactions, which she would bring to the doctor and I think would sort of at least add a little bit of credence or give them some idea that maybe this was something truly medical going on rather than, say, maybe some sort of anxiety disorder or something like that, which I think at one point it was mistaken for. So, but yes, generally speaking, the symptoms were not and are not readily visible, even though the pain is quite real.
And you mentioned that you had on your own come to the conclusion or the suspicion that it was related to exposure to the sunlight. I wonder if you could tell us how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some ways, I would be lying if I could remember in specifics how how that came to be. I think, when I was very young, and this is relayed by my parents, I think there were a number of times where they had brought me to the beach or to a park, and I would, scream and cry, and I wouldn't be able to sleep for nights. And, they didn't know what was going on. And I think probably at age 3 or 4, I actually used to love playing out in a little sandbox on the back deck of the house growing up. And I loved, construction and trucks and those types of things. And depending on the time of day, I would be more exposed to the sun than others. And I would have to imagine that was probably one of the more evident contexts in which I could start to develop some cause and effect relationship between the sun and the pain that I was feeling. Beyond that, it was probably experiences of just being outside with my older sister or with friends and kind of recognizing, hey, if I have my hand or my foot in the sun for too long, it really starts to get pretty hot. And I'm looking around and it doesn't seem like anybody else is feeling the same degree of heat or pain that I am.
Your parents aren't on the podcast with us. And if they were, I would ask them, what they made of this. And I wonder if you remember them taking seriously your complaints about pain after being outside and what they thought. I know you mentioned that your mom took some photos. So clearly, what do you recall about how your parents talked to you about this?
My poor parents. I really have to get the full story from them, but they certainly took me seriously from the start. I think they had a very difficult time understanding, especially at the beginning, what was going on. I think it was probably pretty evident to them from the first few severe reactions where symptoms were visible. So swelling, redness, those types of things that lasted for a number of days rather than hours. But whether it was an allergy to something or some other insult or hypersensitivity to nature that I was experiencing. But I do think that the chain or train of doctors that I had mentioned before that I had seen before coming to a diagnosis is evidence that, of course, my parents took it seriously enough to try to figure out what was going on. I can only imagine what it must have been like to feel helpless to make me feel better, other than, over time, they also put together and I became able to communicate that it had something to do with the sun.
Yeah, I'm sure that was difficult for your parents and for you as well. So many rare conditions like porphyria are difficult to diagnose. Seeing is believing. And when you can't see, it's very difficult to figure it out, to trust what you're hearing for the physicians, Wow. You noticed that you were different than other kids. They weren't having pain from the sun. Do you remember any other reaction? I imagine it was really frustrating that an activity that you really loved, like playing in the sandbox, resulted in your experiencing pain. No explanation for it.
Absolutely. And in my direct experience, as in a lot of ways, the bigger issue at hand, so to speak, the physical pain is obviously not pleasant and is challenging to endure and to know that you will experience it if you do something as simple as go outside for too long. But there's definitely this deeper, psychological and emotional impact that porphyria definitely has had in my experience. And one interesting kind of peculiarity, I would say, of EPP is that the symptoms are not evident to other people. It provides kind of an interesting contrast or paradox of, generally speaking, I look like anyone else walking down the street, and yet I could be in the midst of a reaction, or I could be fully concentrating on trying to avoid a reaction or getting to a spot of shade out of the sun, those types of things. And so it is a very internal disease, I would say. A lot of the experience of having EPP is about avoiding pain, is about managing the pain while you're around other people or trying to get things done, even though that pain is not evident to others.
So, Jay, you mentioned that there's really a significant psychological and emotional aspect to living with porphyria, with EPP. So could you tell us about that?
There are anxiety and fear are probably built into the disease foundationally for me in my experience. And that's really rooted pretty deeply in the avoidance of pain. Exposure to the sun over the course of my life, 32 years, definitely trains you to be very vigilant about anything that could cause a reaction. And I think there's a lot of anxiety that, in my experience, has developed from that. Fear and anxiety are a big part of it. It does have, my life, it's had significant effects in terms of, how I viewed myself from a very young age and how I related to myself and my place in the world. I think it took me a long time to sort of figure out how I could reconcile with the disease that I have.
Yeah. So can you share how you did view yourself?
Yeah, I think when I was young, a lot of shame and disgust were probably dominant emotions, which, those are pretty strong words, and I almost hesitate to use them just because obviously there's a certain degree of vulnerability that I'm that I'm signing up for here and talking about it. But I think I saw these inabilities, not being able to do the things that other kids were doing, and sometimes catching flack for it or being made fun of for it, I think reflected that back on me as being less than or not being good enough. I felt like I was missing a key part of myself that would allow me to do what everyone else could do.
Yeah. As if this was a choice or was like, well, I can't do it and I'm different than other kids and that makes me less than or not as good as.
Exactly. And, rationally, it doesn't make too much sense. But I think when those sorts of things come on the brainwaves when you're young, it's hard to rationally sort them out.
Absolutely. So the kind of limitations that are imposed by EPP became part of the way that you thought about yourself, and it resulted in feeling shame and sometimes disgust, which is a very strong word, but I am grateful that you're being straight with us. I think that's really important that we learn about that. I'm going to guess that your experience was not that different than other kids who are living with EPP who also felt like, oh, I'm really different. I can't do things that other kids can do, and I'm not as good as them.
Absolutely. Isolation, the feeling of loneliness was definitely predominant in my experience as a kid. And, even through adolescence and in some ways adulthood, there's a certain degree to which it's hard to fully understand what that person was experiencing, right?
Yeah. You talk about a deep emotional experience, how you think about yourself, but to the rest of us, you look fine. I'm sitting looking right at you. You look completely fine. And I imagine it's really hard for people to get. And again, isolating because you live in a society of sun worshippers. And, think of the first warm, sunny day. For those of us who live in the northern part, people go out to feel that, the warm rays of the sun. And for you, those rays are like poison to you. And that's your kryptonite, as Superman might say. And there must have been times when you really felt really isolated due to the way that you have needed to live to protect yourself from the sun.
Right. I mean, in some sense, it's been my mortal enemy for all my life. It's been very odd for me to look at people and imagine what it likes for the sun to feel good, right? It has seemed impossible, I think, in a lot of ways, that it would be something that could be enjoyable. What does that feel like to is it just a little bit warm? Is it the same thing as sort of being inside and indoor lights you don't even really notice? It's always been hard for me to sort of conceive of what it's like to have the sun on your skin without feeling scared that you're going to experience pain.
I want to go back to something that you talked about before, which was anxiety. And I know that it doesn't always happen that when you feel anxiety, there are sort of words associated to it. But if you can imagine now your anxiety speaking and your fear, what words come to you?
Well, it's interesting to think about. I think one way in which I experience, I think, a sort of more general, vague anxiety in my day-to-day experiences, even when I am inside and undercover, so to speak, usually, kind of the middle hours of the day, from late morning to early afternoon, I think I tend to feel just a little bit more restless, a little bit more sort of, emotional vibration in those hours, mostly because, that's when the sun tends to be highest and strongest, even though I am generally inside during those hours of the day. And that's something I've become more conscious of, is that there seems to be a sort of automatic response.
It's as if the sun is your enemy, and you know that the sun at the beginning of the day starts out weaker and it's less threatening, but then it reaches its peak strength and it can really cause you harm. And even if you're not out in the sun, you're conditioned, you've habituated this alertness to what the sun is doing.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. And on the flip side, I think the early morning and sort of dusk are calmer times, I would say. To add an extra layer to that, I would say dusk even more so than dawn, because in dawn, the sun might be low and there might be big shadows to move between, but I'm also understanding that it's going upward, right? At that point, it's coming up into the sky. Whereas dusk, once it feels safe enough to be out there for an extended period of time, I know that it's only, dropping further and further, and the shadows are getting longer. So dusk has always been, ever since I was a little kid, the best time of day, because there's still enough light to enjoy what everyone else enjoys.
I have to say that I just find this really kind of profound, that something that exists, sunlight, is part of our world, and that it is such a threat to you. I know this is going to sound strange, but I remember being young and I would go and get the newspaper on our front lawn, and I was worried that a tiger would come and get me. And there were no tigers living in New Jersey where I was living at that time, but it's almost as if you live among tigers, and the tigers could get you at any moment if you dare to go out during the peak sunlight.
No, that's exactly right. One thing I've verbalized to fellow EPP patients, worries about avoiding pain, worries about avoiding the sun, do just seem to reserve, a corner of brain space in permanence, and that just sort of, in some ways, narrow the rest of the space there is. It almost feels like, you're operating with just a little bit less bandwidth. You're always sort of thinking about this extra factor of,
your attention is always divided between what's happening in front of you and your awareness of what's happening with the sun.
That's exactly right.
So Jay, tell us a little bit what your life is like in general. Who are you and what are you up to?
I've always found who are you to be a pretty profound question. Ways to describe myself, what I do from day to day. I've entered medical school, but that certainly isn't the only descriptor. It's been a pretty circuitous path in my life to find myself where I am now. And, I'm 32 years old. And before I came to medicine, a very odd zigzagging path through everything from coaching college volleyball in my early 20s to working in the business world, working in marketing and advertising, consulting. And so from a profession standpoint, I've sort of been all over the place since graduating undergraduate school. But I'm also, a son to two amazing parents and a brother to my older sister, Mariel. I'd like to think of myself first and foremost as just a good family member, someone who, cares a lot about other people and the well-being of other people. And I'm someone that I think is deeply curious about the world. And I think, a big part of that has been my experience having a chronic illness and having to navigate that. I think has prompted me to ask a lot of questions about what life is about, what the world is about, how it works, how human biology works, how nature works, and where to find meaning in all of those things as a way to relate to my fellow human beings.
That's a lovely answer. And I think what you point out is, when you experience adversity in your life, for better or worse, you learn that, life isn't easy. Most of us have our challenges, and the ones who don't are the ones who probably don't look at their challenges or talk about them. So it makes you more open and sensitive to what the experiences are of others. And I love that.
Thank you. Amy, were you going to say something?
She wants you to marry her daughters, both of them. So You doing okay, Jay?
I'm doing great. Yeah.
I'd like to have you on every podcast that we do, just so you know that. So pre-diagnosis, you developed a good sense of what was going on and that it was the sun exposure that was causing this. What happened where someone finally said, "Oh, I think I know what this is"?
My mom will probably correct me when she listens to this. I think it involved, at least one pediatrician. For sure saw another dermatologist before seeing the one that ultimately made the diagnosis. A neurologist might have been involved at some point, an allergist certainly. And I think also, which I understand to be not all that uncommon, was a psychiatrist, child psychiatrist, to evaluate something psychosomatic, that this was something going on in my mind rather than in my body, so to speak. What order those different specialists were in, I don't recall, and I'm sure my mom has it, but ultimately was referred to this pediatric dermatologist at Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut. And I was the first patient that he had seen with EPP. I think on his evaluation, I think he had some suspicion, but hadn't had the experience of seeing a patient with EPP before. And so he had consulted a colleague of his and had ordered some diagnostic tests that ultimately led to a solid diagnosis when I was 7 years old.
So the pediatric dermatologist had never seen someone with EPP, but he was attentive enough and he believed you.
That's right. And one thing that I didn't mention earlier that I think is worth mentioning is over the course of my childhood and now, if you look very closely, particularly at the tops of my arms and my hands, you'd see a lot of very kind of small white scars that accumulated over time from exposure. And I'm Caucasian, I'm fair skinned. They're kind of hard to pick out because there's not a lot of contrast. But I think he had a sharp enough eye to see those and, gain some suspicions.
I'm so glad that you were able to find someone who recognized this. And any instructions from that doctor or subsequently, like how you're supposed to manage this?
Unfortunately, I mean, at that time, so that would have been 1998, I think. There were even fewer treatment options than there are today, which is kind of wild because there are very few today. Yeah. But he suggested something called beta carotene, which is an antioxidant. It's a molecule that you find in carrots that give them their orange color. This was something that had been tested over time and mostly on the East Coast for EPP with varying results. So he suggested trying beta carotene. The issue was these pills were massive. They were like horse pills, and you had to take 6 or 8 of them a couple times a day. And I just couldn't get them down as a kid. And so my poor parents, we tried everything of like emptying the capsules into, a piece of fruit to eat that. And it was, disgusting. And I just couldn't, get it down, tolerate it. And even then, even having done some version of giving it a fair shake, it really didn't seem to have any positive effect. Yeah. And then the other thing was sunlight avoidance. The main tactic, if you can't avoid the sun, is covering the parts of your body that would otherwise be exposed.
So can you tell us what that involves? I mean, sun avoidance would mean that you stay indoors, but what's the protective action?
What it boils down to is wearing long sleeves, wearing long pants in times of the year and in climates where most people are not wearing those items of clothing, right? They're wearing shorts and t-shirts. What you find out very quickly in early experimentation with protective clothing, if you're someone with EPP, is that even, a sliver of skin that is left exposed, say between the end of a long sleeve shirt and the start of like a glove to cover your hands, will get hit just as it will if it's fully uncovered. What that means in specifics is, wearing long pants, always wearing closed-toed shoes, so never flip-flops. I think many people have learned that lesson painfully. My feet tend to be just as sensitive as my hands and my face. Those are sort of the three most sensitive areas of my body. But long sleeves, or even a hoodie or a sweatshirt to help cover your neck, gloves for sure, and then if it's really about spending an extended period outside in the sun, wearing not just a wide brim hat, but also a mask. I mean, if you really want to shoot for no symptoms at all, a mask that leaves pretty much nothing but your eyes to see out of, which understandably many people who might see you out like that may threatening. But yeah, it really looks like just how you would imagine covering every part of your body would look like if you're going out to ski in very cold temperatures.
So today or yesterday or tomorrow, you need to go out, do something with exposure to the sun. Is that what your practice is now, or including the mask? Or
the mask, I would say, is the most variable part of the protective regime. I have pretty severe sun sensitivity as far as EPP patients go, or at least for me, I generally have just a few minutes before I start to get kind of warning signs of an imminent reaction. And so I really do have to be careful and mindful about putting on protective clothing, even if it's for something as simple as running to the grocery store, which might be a total of 10 minutes in the car. And that's another point, which is, even sunlight passing through glass can also incite a reaction. So if I'm going for a drive that's any longer than 15, 20 minutes, I'll for sure have everything on, including, gloves for my hands, which obviously have to be on the steering wheel. But for anything longer than 15, 20 minutes, we'll usually wear a mask to prevent a reaction on my face or neck.
So you have a small window where you can use moderate protection, and beyond that, you need more protection. And a car offers little or no protection. So you have to count the time in the car, and it's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. I use the term my sun clock, being aware of my sun clock or my sun bank account, and knowing that I only have so many dollars to spend by the end of the day if I don't want to get a reaction. So
it's like the, I don't know if they still use them, but like X-ray techs would wear a little pin that measured exposure just to make sure that didn't go into the unhealthy range. And it's exactly how it is, although I doubt that there is any kind of sensor that provides that information. And what else does it take for you to manage this?
Yeah. Planning is kind of your next best tool, and a very necessary tool is, when am I going to do the things that I need to do? And will I run into issues with the sun that may make that harder or may prevent me from getting things done? So really thinking about, what time of day you may be running errands or commuting to work or whatever it is. And I've developed a little bit of a sense of pride in my sense of direction, because years of training of understanding the sun's path and where it is in the sky at certain times of year, and just understanding that, hey, in the morning, if I'm living west of the place where I'm working, I'm going to be driving directly into the sun. And so there's going to be more light bouncing off the cars in front of me, the road in front of me, up into my face, that I need to leave at this time, or it's better to find a place that's east of where I work or where I go to school so that I can drive against the sunlight.
I don't know if this is actually historically accurate, but I think the Aztecs worship the sun, and you're the anti-Aztec, but with the same attentiveness to the sun. But
right, the same, the same respect.
Yeah, and anything else? I mean, you're not getting a lot of vitamin D without sun exposure, and do you have to be attentive to that? And are there other aspects of care for EPP that would be helpful to know?
That's a great question. So I do take a vitamin D supplement, as I think is recommended for most EPP patients. But as far as other strategies, I mean, I think one thing that has done me a lot of benefit, or accepting to some degree the social perception that others may have if you're wearing long sleeves or a hoodie and pants and gloves and a hat and or a mask in the middle of July. I think that aspect, which is not insignificant, of course, we're social animals, and we, care for better, for worse, what other people think. And that's important for a whole number of reasons. But, that hesitation to visualize, right, to kind of make it tangible and very evident to others that I'm different, was an impediment to taking all the measures that would be prudent to take in order to avoid a reaction.
Yeah, I imagine that there are people who it's just too embarrassing to be so covered up for sort of social desirability, don't do it, and then they really pay the price afterwards.
Oh yeah. And I mean that was something I've done many times, which is just, you know what, I'm just going to pay the price, and I'm probably going to regret it later, but I'd rather not feel embarrassed for, this picnic I've been invited to, or this event for school, or whatever it is. And that is a shame, because I think there are a lot of painful memories in there of signing up for the pain, even though, technically there was an option to avoid it.
And it's hard to miss out on events that take place out of doors. Talk about increasing isolation and also losing your ability to socialize and connect with others, and really challenging being invited to an outdoor wedding, for example.
That's exactly right. And yeah, at this point in my life, I've learned certain ways to politely say no or decline if it's sort of easiest that way, or if it's likely to, if the price being paid is affordable from a social standpoint, or
yes.
And I think a lot of people are sort of forced to learn how to do that, but it is a very difficult aspect of the disease, is knowing you might be missing out on something, or again, just another affirmation of me being different than other people.
Oh yeah,
we were all kind of on the same page when we were hanging out and breaking bread inside over lunch, but as soon as people want to go for a walk outside, it's that divide comes back down.
Being different hasn't changed from when you were a boy. I am going to guess that there's a continuous stream of people that you need to explain this to.
It's a difficult thing to navigate, deciding who to tell and when and what context. This feeling of being less than, or of not being as good as, I still defend against. And so, anything that might incite pity, that's something I generally tend to avoid.
Has it been an issue in romantic relationships? People, when they hear about it, and
I've been very fortunate to have loving and supportive partners in my life. I think it's always been probably more of an issue in my mind than it is in their mind. But I think I always sort of just assume that, it would be something that might be a deal breaker for someone, or just a total bummer at the very least, which I totally understand. I would love someone that I can go to the beach with or go on hikes with. It has been a factor to consider in romantic relationships, but fortunately, it has not been an inhibiting factor in any major way.
Good. I'm really glad to hear that, and that there are other good people like you out there who are not living with EPP, but who understand that we all have a struggle of one sort or another, and this is yours. So, Jay, you've been enormously generous with your time for us, and it's been fascinating in terms of thinking about life with EPP, and we're so appreciative of your sharing your story with us.
It's an absolute honor to be able to talk about it in this context, and thank you so much for your kindness and understanding and insightful questions. It's been a real pleasure.
Jay is an incredibly lovely person. I can see why Amy wants her daughters to marry him.
Yeah, I love that. Good thinking, Amy.
Jay had a comfortable, calm way of explaining EPP that could be really difficult to talk about, and he shared that with us so generously.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts about what Jay shared with us. First of all, the invisibility of EPP to the outside world. I think it's always difficult when other people cannot see what's going on with you, and particularly living with EPP, which takes so much care and caution about sunlight. I keep thinking about how Jay says, we're a nation of sun worshipers. And I think that's really true, that most of us have such positive associations with sunlight. And Jay's associations are anxiety provoking, how he has to use part of his brain all of the time to think about and plan how to avoid exposure to sunlight. Although Jay just seems so well-rounded, mature, calm, but it was not lost on me how he said that he's experienced shame and disgust from living with EPP, that this has really been a very difficult journey for him.
Yeah, I think you're right, David. He did a nice job of explaining how EPP is not a physical condition, but really it's also an emotional condition as well. Certainly, Jay seems well adapted and has really over the years worked to understand how to manage his condition.
He mentions about how dusk is kind of liberating for him because finally he could actually be out of doors without direct sunlight and enjoy a little bit of the day without having to worry so much. That worrying, anxiety, monitoring constantly about the location of the sun and his exposure to sun just is a huge burden. Let's just say it straight out.
It's so consuming. I keep visualizing him when he was talking about wearing long sleeves and gloves and a mask and a wide brim hat. That's a really dramatic description. Having to adjust to avoiding exposure to the sun, it can be really, really isolating. And Jay explained that in a variety of different ways, how this condition can really limit his life and his ability to interact and engage with others.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. To hear how much of his time is occupied by planning not to be exposed by the sun and the real harm done to him, permanent harm, we realize that there is a great need for effective treatment for this condition. This condition really interferes with living life as most of us are accustomed to. I'm really hopeful that better treatment becomes available soon for people living with EPP.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jay and Bhavik, for helping us learn about EPP. And thank you to our producer, Amy Brooks. To learn more about EPP, visit the United Porphyrias Association at porphyria.org. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and write to us with any comments or suggestions at onrare@bridgebio.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on Rare.